All right, I think we will get started. Welcome, everyone. My name is Erin Sikorsky. I am the director of the Center for Climate and Security at the Council on Strategic Risks, and I'm pleased to welcome you to today's webinar, A New Fire Era, Securing America Against Worsening Wildfires. For those unfamiliar with the center's work, we are a nonpartisan, nonprofit research institute based in Washington, D.C., and we work globally. We examine how climate impacts shape the national security landscape and what policy approaches and interventions are needed to manage those risks. Today's topic is wildfires, unfortunately, a very timely one this summer. I spend part of my summer in the state of Wisconsin, and earlier in July, we had multiple days my kids couldn't be outside at camp because of the wildfire smoke, and I'm sure many of you have experienced similar challenges. But our topic today is the ways in which wildfire intersect with and reshape the national security landscape. We have a really excellent panel for you today of experts who have worked at the nexus of these issues at different levels of government and in different capacities, and I will introduce them momentarily. But I wanted to begin with a snapshot from this year of how we at the center are seeing wildfire and the wildfire and security nexus take shape. A reminder that this webinar is on the record and being recorded, and there will be plenty of time at the end of the conversation for questions from the audience as well. And I think everyone's familiar with the Zoom approach by now, but you can add your questions into the chat box there, and I'll be able to ask them of the panelists. So before I do the introductions, I just wanted to highlight three trends that we are watching at the Center for Climate and Security vis-a-vis climate change, wildfires, and security. The first is really that militaries are increasingly on the front lines of wildfire response. Our tracking at the center indicates that since January of this year, militaries globally have deployed roughly 112 times in response to wildfires alone, which is about one deployment every couple of days. The scale of these deployments varies enormously. Some deployments involve thousands of personnel, as we've seen in Spain and France in recent weeks. Others are far smaller. Japan's self-defense forces, for example, may respond with a single helicopter and a handful of soldiers to a particular fire in the country. But these deployments can strain military capacity, and the fires themselves we see threatening that capacity directly. In France, we saw wildfires recently coming close to critical defense infrastructure. Just this past week near Spokane, Washington, as we were talking a little bit before the webinar started, military families had to be evacuated as fire encroached on a nearby installation and community. So that has real consequences for readiness. The second trend is wildfires undermining national resilience more broadly, damaging critical infrastructure, energy, transportation, hospitals, for example, and the imposition of the opportunity cost, right? When governments are consumed by fighting fires and paying for them, they have less bandwidth to focus on or fund other security priorities competing for their attention. And then third, wildfires are being weaponized geopolitically as well. We're seeing actors exploit fire events, whether through disinformation, blame narratives, or attempts to inflame domestic divisions with countries that they're already perhaps having conflict or tensions with, or even internally within countries as well. So just as a high-level overview, I think those are some of the pathways through which we see wildfires affecting security, and I know our panelists will get into much more detail on this, including ways in which governments can think about managing some of these risks. So I'm going to introduce our three speakers. As I said earlier, they'll each give a brief overview, and then we'll move into a conversation, and you'll have some time to put questions to them. So without further ado, the first speaker we'll have today is Samantha Medlock, who currently serves as the president of Climate Risk Advisors, And until May 2025, she served as FEMA's assistant administrator, leading the agency's resilience strategy. Her career spans the climate and security communities, senior counsel to the House Select Committee on the Climate Crisis. She's worked on resilience provisions and national defense authorization bills, advisory roles in the Pentagon, National Security Council, DHS, and all grounded in an early career as a local official. Then we'll turn to John Conger, who preceded me as director of the Center for Climate and Security, and also served as the Principal Deputy Undersecretary of Defense, Comptroller in the Pentagon during the Obama administration. And from 2009 to 2015, he oversaw the Pentagon's installations and environment portfolio, which is where this wildfire nexus really comes in. And finally, we'll have Christine McMorrow, who is the Deputy Director of Strategic Communications for CAL FIRE in California, where she leads communications for the nation's largest state firefighting agency. She began her career in 1989 as a seasonal firefighter on the Stanislaus National Forest's Bald Mountain crew and spent 2 decades in forest health and fire science education before joining CAL FIRE in 2020. So as you'll see, we've got a wide variety of expertise here and working with different types of government agencies on these topics, everything from the legislative branch to the executive branch to the subnational level. And I really can't wait to hear from these folks today. So thanks again, everyone, for joining us. And I'm going to turn it over to Sam to kick us off. And I understand she has some slides which she'll share with us on the webinar. So Sam, over to you.
Thanks a lot, Erin. And if it's all right with you, I've decided to skip the slides and just, we'll just be human and speak from the heart here. Because I think given, the current events, this is a very rapidly changing situation and the data are already outdated even from 24 hours ago. But I really want to sort of start off with a framing around the ways that wildfire is a homeland security problem. And yet we continue to treat it like a land management problem from a budget standpoint. Just to kind of go through the stats, we do see with the latest fires around Spokane, Washington, more than 65,000 people evacuating. Evacuations are continuing through today. More than 700 structures are lost. Another 400 to 500 are being evaluated. And Governor Ferguson has declared a statewide emergency and a burn ban. The Washington National Guard has been activated. And so, Erin, to your point, all these ways that this reverberates through our first responder cadres, through National Guard, through every branch of the military, and the ways that it affects mission readiness, our ability to operate, our ability to train. But I also want to talk about fire behavior briefly and the ways that wildland fire, as it encroaches into the wildland-urban interface and then into developed areas, can stop behaving like a wildland fire and more like a mass conflagration, which is the real fear. We've seen this happen in urbanized areas before, and that's a real fear here with Spokane and other fires that are burning in the arid West. So although Northwest Spokane is wildland-urban interface, Indian Trail and the neighborhoods around it are subdivisions built into ponderosa pine and grassland between the 1980s and 2010s. This is 15 minutes from downtown. It's inside a metro area of more than 600,000 people. And that's what the wildland-urban interface is today. This is not just cabins in the woods. This is suburban metropolitan America. And it's one of the fastest growing land use patterns in the country. Once these structures ignite, structure to structure spread takes over. And again, you're no longer fighting a wildland fire, you're fighting an urban conflagration, but with wildland resources. That's a different problem, and our institutions are not organized for it. In terms of the security frame, we see a domestic mass evacuation, militarized response, critical infrastructure at risk inside the continental United States with no adversary involved other than arsonists, as it turns out. And so this is really a precedent that we have to keep in mind. The other thing that I would note is that this is really the new baseline. This is not an outlier. We see nearly 45,000 fires. We've impacted more than 5 million acres, and yet we're not even into the historical peak of the season. So the thing to keep in mind, though, is the pace, not just the number. So on July 16th, we saw 3.6 million acres involved. By July 24th, we were over 4 million acres. And now into August, we're nearing 5.2 million. So that's over 1 million acres in 10 days. Again, we're operating through a strong El Nino. We've got drought across 75% of the West, record low Western snowpack this spring. And then smoke is an issue. So in July, as you noted, Erin, more than 120 million Americans were under air quality alerts from fires burning in Canada. That's a third of the country experiencing the health effects of a fire that no American agency independently could have prevented, suppressed, or mitigated. There's no evacuation order just for smoke. There's no real disaster declaration or governance framework. So this is a point that I'm going to return to as I kind of look to bring it in for a landing here in a moment. But I want to talk for a moment briefly about from within the federal government, particularly DHS and FEMA, what did we have while I was working there and what did we lack? Certainly, we have one of the most generous disaster response and recovery enterprises in the world. The response system is genuinely world class. And so I don't put this as a complaint, but there are really important things that we did not have that we still don't have. So if you ask who owns wildfire in the federal government, the answer that you get is a list, not a name or a role. Interior and Agriculture own the land. DHS and FEMA own the disaster, along with increasingly state and local leaders. HHS and EPA deal with the health effects. DOD owns the surge capacity that nobody planned for, but nobody owns and manages the problem. Also, money moves after. So hazard mitigation is the thing that we know that works, the thing that we fund the last. Pre-disaster mitigation investment earns us returns of $6 for every dollar we spend on average. For things like building codes and standards, the return is even greater, but we spend the overwhelming majority of funding, and not just on wildfire, but disasters writ large, after the problem. And then lastly, smoke has no home. There's no authority, no program, no thresholds or triggers or governing frameworks. And yet it is the largest population impact of wildfire and the least well governed. So these are gaps that are a failure of any one agency. These are problems that are happening at the intersection. So we've really got to confront these issues and think about ways that we need to move from federal to state to local, make sure that we're building stronger capacity, make sure that we are getting out ahead of the problem. We have plenty of warning that this was going to be a dry season, a hot season with very little snowpack, and yet here we are. We also are getting better and better at technology. We are getting better at leveraging AI, drones, eyes in the sky. And so while we see real advancements in our technical and technological capabilities, we are not bringing the governance into play to go with it. So I want to bring this in really for a landing and focus on really 3 actions that I would recommend that we take on. One is to name an owner. Just coordination across departments or agencies, or vertical coordination across levels of government, or even across economic sectors is not accountability, and it's not governance. We have coordinated this problem for generations. So somebody needs to own it end to end with authority that spans detection through smoke. So a concrete first step is to look at technologies like FireGuard and programs like FireGuard to make that a program of record. I can now say that it is absurd that that capability, this valuable, ends up getting renegotiated annually. There is a bill to fix it in House Armed Services. We also need to be moving the money ahead of ignition. We already know the ROI that can earn for us. We know also increasingly which communities are ready, which communities are pre-positioning for this issue. The obstacle is the budget structure and the program complexity, both of which Congress can confront and fix. But this simplification matters as much as the money. Communities that need the help the most are the least equipped to navigate a maze of bureaucracy. The last thing I'll mention is putting insurability on the agenda. we need to be looking at the ways that insurance markets are measuring and responding to fire and smoke risk. We need to be tracking that as a national indicator and look at insurance withdrawal as the early clear signal about where we're having problems, really leveraging the technical capabilities, the analytic capabilities that insurance brings to the table. But right now, there's a disconnect between the world of insurance, reinsurance, catastrophe modeling, and the worlds of homeland and national security. Closing that gap is going to be a challenge, but one that we should take on. So really, Spokane is kind of it's not a warning about the future. It's about what's happening today. So I really appreciate the opportunity to join and help kick off this discussion. Back to you.
Wonderful. Wow, Sam, that was just really a masterclass in both what I think of as, key assumptions that we have that need to be challenged about this threat, and then also where the gaps are in government and how we might bridge some of those. I'm 100% with you on fire guard. It's shocking to me that we haven't figured that out, and such a national security priority. So thank you for setting the table for this conversation. John, let me turn to you for the defense perspective.
Sure. Thanks, Erin, and thanks, Sam. That was wonderful. I hope I can live up to it. So I'm gonna look at things from a military perspective. Why the military cares about wildfire and broadly climate change. I mean, the idea here is that as the military thinks about how to do its job, they are confronted with a world that is changing and becoming more hazardous. And the question then becomes one of what are the impacts to me? How do I continue to do my mission in this environment? And what do I have to do now? How do I have to respond? And so on and so forth. It is obviously a natural hazard, but it is less obviously to folks outside the military that that it is a military mission issue. And so there are, I have a list of like 6 different ways in which the military pays attention to wildfire. I'd like to sort of run through those examples and how it affects the way the military does its job, and then maybe sort of point us in a direction from there. The first one is obvious, and it's the easy one. It's that wildfires occur on military installations and they disrupt missions just because they're in your face. There have been base evacuations, there have been impacts. 2016, there's an example at Vandenberg Air Force Base where space launches were delayed because the wildfire was coming across towards the launch facilities. There's examples in 2020 with Travis Air Force Base, 2021 with Beale Air Force Base. There are wildfires on bases on a regular basis, and the ones that I'm sort of ticking off are ones where you had to evacuate part of the base because of the threat. These are direct threats, in your face threats. The Washington State example today, you've got Fairchild Air Force Base, where I think Erin, you alluded to it in your opening comments. The 92nd Refueling Wing commander started requiring evacuations of folks that were in the fire zones outside the base, but people live outside the base, and that affects the way they do their job. So there is absolutely direct impact, but there's also indirect impact. Sam talked about the smoke. I had to live through the smoke here in Washington, D.C. It spread over a large area. That changes how you schedule training. It affects how you do your missions. It is smoke is visible and obvious. We don't train on bases if the temperature is over 90 degrees because it creates a harmful environment for the troops. That's not the point of training. Well, neither is sending them out in smoke and hazardous environments where breathing the air is going to make them sick too, and ultimately have a negative readiness effect. So you don't do the training, there's a readiness effect. You go out there and do the training in the hazardous environment, and there's a readiness effect. And it's really a challenging question because you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. But it's not just that. So the wildfires will affect other things that affect missions on the base. They'll affect transportation. They'll affect power, communications. There are a whole host of things where the wildfire doesn't come anywhere near the base, but yet it affects the base. And so those sort of secondary impacts are ones that you have to do the math for. How likely is it that I lose power because of the wildfire that's going across the power lines in California? And I have, dozens of California bases that are concerned about those kinds of things, but it's not just California. I think this leads into the third category I have, which is communities. The military bases have a tendency to depend on communities for a lot. They've sort of outsourced a lot of functions. Used to get power on the base, used to have all your water facilities on the base, and utilities have moved outside the base for a lot of these things already. It's cheaper that way, but it imposes risk. And so these days, the military installation depends on the local community for water, for wastewater, for power, for communications, for healthcare, for education, for housing. There are a wide range here of things that basically in two-thirds of the people live off base in general on your average base. And what that means is that the base can be as resilient as possible. It can be 100% resilient. But if the base is resilient and the community is not, the base is still screwed. And so you want to be able to think that through too. And that goes back to the Fairchild Air Force Base example that we're living through right now. Communities were affected outside the base, and military personnel were living, and their families were living at those facilities. That's going to affect missions on the base. If those people evacuate, that's going to have an impact on whether things get executed on base. Um, Fourth, training lands management. So if I've got more than 20, I think it's more than 25 million acres that DoD manages across the country. That is roughly the size of the state of Virginia. And that's the lands that DoD controls. I will say to my friends out there who know the USDA, the Forest Service, or BLM, DoD is like the little brother to those guys. They have 10 times as much stuff as DoD does that they have to pay attention to. But there's still a lot of lands to manage for DoD. And so wildfire affects these lands on a regular basis. There are roughly 1 million acres of DoD land burned each year, and about 65% of that is prescribed fire. So let me talk a little bit about prescribed fire, because what DoD does is it goes out, and I say DoD, it was DoD when I was there, DOW, DoD. We can have that debate later. It's just this is easier for me to talk this way. So what DoD does is it goes out to its installations and it has programs to burn certain lands in order to block where wildfire would come across and impact a larger part of the base. They're protecting themselves, and different installations have different scales of the program. But there are wildfires that come from the outside. There are wildfires that come from the inside. Over 60% of wildfires on DoD bases are caused by DoD training incidents. And so this is going to happen whether there's a threat outside the base or not. And so they have to learn how to manage those lands inside the base through, response capabilities or prescribed fire as they go along. So that's another piece of it. It is inherent and integral to training lands management at a DoD installation. Fifth, this is something Erin mentioned earlier, which was forces that are used to fight fires are not being able to be used for something else. A helicopter that deploys to address a fire is not being used, held ready, or used for operational missions that were what it was originally trained for. And so this impacts the National Guard quite a bit. But others as well. It's certainly part of the Defense Support for Civilian Authorities mission that DoD has as well. So I think that there's a readiness impact that is growing as fires outside the fence line grow, because we obviously going to help. I say we like I'm still there, but you know what I mean. And then the last category where they were actually devoting significant resources that I'd like to highlight is research. So there's a program called SERDP, the Strategic Environmental R&D program sorry, it's acronym world, right? SERDP. And then there's ESTCP, which I'm going to acronymize for you, which is the Environmental Security Technology Certification Program. These programs are R&D programs within the department that focus on a wide range of strategic environmental issues, one of which is wildfire. Spends about 25 million out of its overall budget on wildfire related issues each year. And those research programs I would put in maybe four different categories. One is fire modeling. Before DoD did its research and before DoD started investing in this, there was no tool that modeled prescribed fire. So DoD researchers and DoD programs funded that and created that. Um, Another is data fusion, creating a sort of a common operating picture in DoD lingo of where the fire is, where it's going, how to understand the fire. They're doing some research into unmanned vehicles, unmanned ground vehicles in particular, to accept risk, so that the individuals, people don't have to accept that risk. And then finally is understanding ecosystem change, and they put some money into that. What do the fuels situations look like in different locations? I want to close with an example, an anecdote, where I sat down a couple weeks ago with CERDIP's main wildfire expert, and he told me a story about Fort Stewart. He said the commander of Fort Stewart was dealing with a problem in April where there were thousands of acres on the base, Fort Stewart, Georgia, that were on fire. Wildfire was coming across the base. This was a big fire across Georgia. There were 90 counties that were, emergency zones set by the governor. And so the base commander turned to his forest folks, his lands management folks, and said, "What missions do I have to curtail on this base? What do I have to stop doing because of the wildfires that are on my base?" And they said, "None, because you have the best prescribed fire program in the country. Because we spend as much money as we spend and as much effort as we spend doing prescribed fire on this base, we have protected off all of the areas where you have to do things. And so these wildfires that are active on your base are not going to stop your mission." I think that is an important takeaway because for the DoD audience in particular, the issue is mission centric. It is not just about proper stewardship on the base or anything like that when you do prescribed fire. It is a readiness investment and is a mission investment to spend money, to spend investment, to spend effort and people on and devote people to managing those lands. And so they're working to sort of manage the consequences of the broader fire risk. And that's the mission-centric perspective, and that's the way DoD will continue to look at it. So I think that's it for me for now, and I'll hand it off.
Wonderful, John. That was really useful to step us through those different angles for defense and think about different entry points to have this conversation with security actors. And one thing I'll note before turning to Christine is I do think discussing wildfires and preparation for wildfires within the military is a place where there is still good bipartisan engagement. On Capitol Hill, for example, the National Defense Authorization Bill last year included provisions related to this. So I think all of those pieces of the puzzle that you laid out are good knowledge to think about how you move these issues forward. So thanks for that. Now let's turn to the state perspective in California and how you're thinking about things. Christine, over to you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Samantha. Thank you, John, for your remarks. My perspective that I am going to provide here is really one that is the on-the-ground perspective. So looking at over the last 7 or 8 years, how CAL FIRE and the state of California has shifted its strategies and tactics on the wildfire crisis. When I joined CAL FIRE in 2020, things were different. And in August of 2020, we had a huge lightning siege that changed everything. Why it changed everything was simultaneously we had over 100 fires start in the state, and instantly, and this was the first time in the digital age that we had had a lightning siege like this. The CAL FIRE website instantly crashed. We had millions of hits. It could not handle it. Once we got it back up and running, realizing this is unacceptable. So on our back end, that security on the back end of just getting people the basic information that they need to stay safe, we weren't able to deliver that. So we were very lucky at the time that our administration and our executive leadership team here recognized the need for an executive level position for our digital infrastructure and technology. So we had just recently hired somebody whose job it was to really secure those things. And so since then, we have spent a lot of time, energy, and money on that back end digital infrastructure, and it paid off. In 2025, January, the LA wildfires began. And within a 3-week period, the CAL FIRE website received over 75 million hits. And the website stayed up and running, delivering information to the public that they weren't able to access anywhere else. At the same time as the public and others were turning to our website for information, timely information on these fires, we had nearly 200,000 attempts at hacking our website. Had we not been prepared for that, the scenario during January 2020 for us could have been very, very different. The state's perspective, the state's response would have been significantly interrupted. So that was something that between 2020 and 2025, we made significant improvements and upgrades. But going back to 2020, at that time, we were really starting to shift how we looked at and predicted wildfires. We were really just starting to get into some modeling software that really helped us better utilize our resources, better predict what might happen next, and not just next in the next 4 to 8 hours, but in the next 24 to 48 hours. Things that were taking our fire managers 24 hours to create, they had it at their fingertips in seconds. So that made a huge difference in how we predict and prepare for upcoming events such as weather. So currently where we're at is we know these different weather events may be coming. And so our software that we're using on the back end, which has gotten more robust, the more we use it, the more data we put into it, the more we get out of it and the better predictions we get. So that's where we're at now with that particular software. But what we're able to do is to move our resources statewide to be better prepared for what might happen in the future as a result of some of these events. So that's just a little bit, couple of scenarios about how we've evolved and adapted because we had to. We had no choice, and we continue on that path. But what I see is some of the issues that we're dealing with are on two fronts. So as I just mentioned, the digital threats. And that's from hackers and misinformation. This misinformation isn't just coming from people in California, it's coming from around the world. And we really did see that on an unprecedented scale during the LA fires. We see it on every wildfire. There's misinformation. Generally, it's handled at the fire by those public information officers there in that local community. But what we're seeing now is that these events are global. There's global interest, and there's global interest in disruption of these events. And so that misinformation, when we have to tackle that, that takes away from the critical resources that we need to inform the community about evacuations and preparedness. It takes away from those resources that are supporting the fire. Similar to what we've already heard from John about military military deployments, if we're doing something else, we can't do our main mission. And so those are some concerns with those digital threats. And our team is constantly evaluating those threats and where they might occur. And on a global scale for our organization, doing things to mitigate those threats. The physical threats, people, arsonists, bad actors, they show up at these events to do harm. Sometimes we have seen folks that want to hurt firefighters, hurt elected government officials, and things like that, that again, take away from that response and recovery and create additional chaos and confusion, create fear and mistrust amongst the public. And one of those things that we have to look at as the state's firefighting agency is protection of our reputation. We work across the state. We have over 14,000 employees that are in nearly every county in California. And so trust is really important. The areas of the state that we protect are private property. Our state, 58% of the land in our state is federally owned. Only 3% is directly owned by the state. The other 40% is private property. So trust for us is extremely important, and that comes by protecting our reputation and securing our digital infrastructure. So what we're seeing right now is that these threats, again, they're not just domestic, but they can lead to loss of life, destroyed infrastructure, and then again, mistrust of government leadership. And so the other thing that, going back to smoke, right? In 2020, some of you may recall images of San Francisco in a glowing orange. That is something that urbanites had not yet experienced. So that brought this wildland crisis into cities. It brought it into town. It brought it home and put this wildfire crisis in front of people who had never had that experience before. And that creates the opportunity for creating your own narrative about what government is doing, about what land managers are doing, and what the solution to the problem is. So we have a whole wide variety of people who had never experienced wildfire, having experience with it, and then beginning to question and gain interest in things that they had never considered before, such as mitigations, fuels reduction, wildland management, and things like that. And so everybody has an opinion, whether you have the education to have an educated opinion or not. And we see that on social media and perpetuated across the board on many channels, that our opinions could become fact. And so we work very hard to ensure that our constituents understand what it is we do, what the background is, and then we use our platforms to educate the public. My role, a big part of my role, is prevention and mitigation. So we are known worldwide for our wildfire response. We have the largest aerial firefighting fleet in the world. We are now the biggest fire department with the addition of personnel. And we know that our local folks are trusted. People do not trust us in Sacramento, our state capital. That's where, we're just a bunch of politicians that don't know what's going on the ground. But we do have our on the ground teams that are trusted. And so how do we utilize them to work with their community, partner with the trusted messengers in their community to ensure that our residents are prepared when disaster strikes? And what we're finding with that challenge is that we now have a new audience. Those folks that are in these urban areas who have never experienced wildfire before. We find that people who have been living in the wildland or even in the wildland urban interface for quite some time and have experienced wildfire, they understand. But folks who live in towns and in these urban areas, their attitude is, it won't happen to me. And that's the attitude that we are trying to shift, because what we're seeing is that it will happen to you. It can happen to you. So looking at this from the perspective of a changing climate, we have seen in 2020, we saw extreme destructive wildfire in places that typically do not see it, along our coastal areas and in our redwood forests, where we typically would see low intensity fire. We had entire redwood forests destroyed. And what created that? It wasn't just a lack of land management or a lack of care. Those actions and those things that we saw weren't typical. But what we're seeing is that what is typical is not what we can expect in the future. And it's very hard for people in the moment to imagine what that next disaster may look like, because preparing for it can be overwhelming. So we are trying to encourage people to take this on in small chunks, but it's hard when people go, what's the point? My insurance isn't going to get lowered. My house is probably going to burn down anyway. So how do we motivate our citizens to do the mitigations to their homes and properties, to prepare themselves and their families for something for a disaster that may never come, or that they just can't imagine? And I think that's what we're seeing right now in Washington State. Is we have experienced it sadly here in California, and we have had time to understand how to respond to these urban environments, the wildland urban interface, and how to do structure protection with your brush regs and things like that. So we have that experience, but other places do not. Right. And we have here in California a robust system and partnerships where we regularly communicate with our Office of Emergency Services, with our federal partners, with our local government partners, so that when we have a disaster in a local community that's not within the CAL FIRE jurisdiction, but we're there to support, we know how to work together. So we have those systems built out in advance. And that really is helping us when that disaster strikes. We know who those people are that we can reach out to in our local government and federal government partners. So what I will wrap up with is just some of the things that we're changing here and how we respond as well in California. Right now, while if you watch the news, the entire West is on fire. It's the worst fire season ever. In California, our stats are actually lower than this time last year and our 5-year average. Now, we are only at the beginning of August, and typically September and October can be our worst fire months of the year. So we are still on guard at the same time as we are supporting our state neighbors. So going back to partnerships, last year, we have always been part of international and state compacts that, where we support other states. But last year we signed a compact that it's called the Northwest Compact. There are about 11 states that are a part of that. California is now one. And so what that does is it allows the exchange, state-to-state exchange of resources when disaster strikes. So for the first time this year, for the first time, we're sending an incident management team to Washington State to help them mitigate and manage what they have going on there. We have 6 incident management teams here in the state that are deployed when a wildfire gets too big for our local folks to manage that disaster. We have just also deployed a management team here in California for about a 7,000 acre fire in the central part of our state. So we have a system for managing these wildfires, and now, because of this Northwest Compact, we are able to take that expertise and experience and support our state neighbors. And going back to what Samantha had said at the beginning, is that we have these wildfires hitting in these urban areas, turning into urban conflagrations, and the expertise that we have to manage that is managing wildland fires. So we have people who are used to working in the woods and the wildland environment that are now being faced with burning homes and community disaster. And how do we make that switch from one type of situation to another, and not just from our response side, but from that mitigation and preparedness side? And those are some of the things that are top of mind for me. Is how do we work with our urban communities to convince people that it can and will happen to you? It may not happen in the typical way. Sadly, you may have somebody push a burning car into dry grass. You may have somebody who is being devious and choosing to create disaster. And those are unexpected and unpredictable events. When we see that it's going to be hot, dry, and windy, we can plan for that. When we know lightning is coming, we can plan for that. We cannot plan for bad actors. We don't know when they're going to strike, but we have to be prepared for that. And the folks that need to be prepared for that type of disaster are people who have not yet had to think about that. And we have an uphill battle with supporting those people and seeing what's possible and getting them to the preparedness level that they need for their life safety and for ours too. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Christine. I think that was a really helpful overview. And I think your focus on information management and cyber threats and all of that, I mean, just really speaks to the broader ecosystem of tools and capacities governments and states need to manage these threats. There is the very immediate fighting the fire on the front lines, but there's so much more to managing all of these risks in the security environment. I'm going to ask a couple questions now. I could ask you guys questions forever. I was so fascinated by everything you talked about. But then we've already got some questions populating the chat here, and I encourage folks to throw more in as we go. But the one thing I wanted to ask, each of you identified different ways in which the security challenges related to wildfires have changed over the course of your career, or even in the course of the past few years. What's your sense of how well that recognition of the change is being absorbed by policymakers and institutions? Where do you still see gaps? How would you manage those gaps? Because I think in the broader climate security conversation, right, we hear a lot of recognition and agreement that climate is a security risk, and people understand all the ways in which it is and how it's changing the security landscape. But then when it comes to actually changing how we do business to manage those risks, that's harder, obviously. And so I'm just curious on this in particular, where do you see governments and institutions in their ability to really respond to these changes? And maybe I'll start with you, Sam. We'll go through the same order if folks want to chime in on this.
Sure, I'd be happy to kick us off. I think really it's a bit of a mixed bag. Christine, it's just such a privilege to share the digital stage with you today. You are part of one of the most, if not the most sophisticated enterprises in the business in the world. And not everybody has that. I think Spokane is blessed to have a very good state partner. But not every state is positioned for what is happening and what is coming. Even as recently as earlier this year, we see Florida, a state that typically is, having its, activation moments around hurricanes or tropical cyclone, dealing with wildfires, and not in a small way. I mean, these can be very significant problems. We see them in other parts of the Eastern Seaboard and other parts of the U.S. And I don't believe that that state and local governments are prepared to take on that mission in many places. I wish that everyone had the sophistication and the commitment and the leadership, really, that we see coming out of Washington and California. I think Colorado is also doing some very good work. But as the problem spreads, many of these capabilities are going to fall short of the moment with potentially real tragic consequences. The other thing that has been discussed, and Christine, I'm really grateful that you brought it up, is the added sort of anthropogenic threat of the bad actor, of the ways that misinformation is getting out ahead of capabilities and response and planning. At the same time, we also see real movements in this administration to devolve more and more of the disaster response and recovery mission to state and local governments. So as that accelerates, we also see more broadly the potential for state and local government capabilities, tribes and territories to be overwhelmed by an incident. And again, that could have real tragic consequences. So I think it's a mixed bag. I think that we do see some state legislatures, we see some local communities, we see regional partnerships springing up that are working to respond to these threats and hazards, that are working to respond to these changes in policy and practice. But I don't believe it's happening fast enough to keep up with the threat.
Thanks, Sam. Yeah, and I'd love to explore more like how can we help to speed that up a little bit. John, do you want to jump in on this?
Yeah, I'll throw a few things in as we think about what's changed over time. I have heard it said many times, and I'm not going to be able to produce the statistic, that we've moved from a fire season to fire all year round. I've heard that over and over again, and that's obviously the data will bear that out. I would also make the observation that some of that season or some of that behavior is predictable, and it's based on lots of things. And I will point out this year we have El Nino, right? And so El Nino, if you look at the forecast, it says we're going to have sort of wetter weather along with the heat across the southern half of the United States and drier up north. And if you sort of extrapolate, you're going to predict there will be a little bit less of a fire impact in the Southern California, for example, but up in the Northwest there would be more. And lo and behold, per Christine's point, so far it's a little bit less than previous year. And in the Northwest we have a very large fire going on. And I'm not going to extrapolate from one data point, but I will make the point that one can prepare better when one listens to the weather. And so important having those layers in place. I'll add another layer for thinking about it from a defense perspective. I make the observation that over the years, I look at the National Defense Authorization Act and see what kind of provisions are put in there. I look for climate and natural hazards types of things. And mitigation, anything having to do with reducing emissions isn't really there. Having to do with preparation and resilience is, but what we've seen come more and more into those bills over the last year, maybe two, is items focused on response. And there's a provision in last year's bill talking about a requirement to have training for Army personnel to put out fires and additional provisions in recovering from disasters and rebuilding after damage, so on and so forth. So there are pieces that we'll start to see in these bills about response, acknowledging the response without actually saying what it's all about and what it's being driven by. But it seems to be an acceptable place to be as far as a bipartisan progress type of element. And I guess the third thing I would put in is that there's always the thing that continues to move forward is technology. And so if I think back, when I was doing this in the department 10, 15 years ago, to now, the technologies that exist are better than they were then. The modeling is better than it was then. The common operating picture is better than it was then. The ability to fuse data is better than it was then. And so And frankly, now we are besieged on all corners from AI, whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. It is a capability that one can certainly leverage to address more of the decision support and so on and so forth. I think all of those pieces are important parts of the puzzle as we think forward to what has changed.
Thanks, John. That's helpful. Christine?
Yeah, what I'm thinking about is our California legislature is very aware of the wildfire crisis. It is front and center. Starting in 2019 is when we really started to see legislation toward wildfire mitigation and response. That's when we started to see some movement on additional aircraft for our fleet. We have seen the legislature pass budget bills increasing our staffing for health and wellness purposes as much as for response capabilities. After the January 2025 wildfires, Cal Fire alone, just Cal Fire, we were analyzing well over 100 bills, new bills coming in. Now, the majority of those were about response and mitigation, not wildfire security. So I think that is securing our systems and our data. That is something that we need additional movement on. Samantha, thank you for the compliment on what we're doing here with our technology and our data infrastructure. We are our executive level IT position. He works very, very hard to ensure that our digital infrastructure is strong, because that can be our weakest point. We are so reliant on it. We utilize digital technology in so many ways in our response capabilities. If that becomes disrupted, that becomes a disaster within itself. If we don't have communications between people on the field and in the air, that's problematic. That grounds our aircraft, things like that. When we are able to utilize additional capabilities where we weren't before, for instance, I just heard of an example this past weekend where we've been testing drones for heavy haul. We had a drone pull over 400 feet of wildland firefighting hose off a fire, 1,200 pounds. And I thought, well, if I was a firefighter, I would be pretty darn happy about that, because pulling hose is not an easy job. So they're pretty happy about that. But also, I think just recognizing, going back to our citizens and the mitigation efforts. Our legislature has passed budget bills that have extended down to our citizens. So we have a pilot program, a home hardening pilot program going on right now that is approved at the federal level. It has federal and state funding behind it, where we are working with 6 vulnerable communities around the state to do community hardening efforts. What does it look like if an entire community is prepared for wildfire? Their defensible space is done. Their homes have been retrofitted with flame resistant materials. What does that look like? What does it look like for insurance? What does it look like for community survivability and preparedness? So those are some of the things that are coming through the legislature down to us, that we are evaluating these bills all the time and ensuring that that they make sense for the direction we want to go, and then also showing, improvements in our security on the ground, in our response and mitigation. I do think we can improve on our policies regarding our digital safety and infrastructure.
Great. Thank you all. That was, I think, really helpful. I, of course, have more questions, but we already have great questions in the Q&A box. So I think I'm going to move to some of those. And if we have time, I will pipe up again with my questions. But folks, please continue to add your questions there. The first one I'm going to ask is, what are the main, from your perspective, legal, fiscal, or political barriers to more effective multi-actor disaster risk response? Is it more about a lack of ability to combine funding streams with the federal government or other and state levels rather than like the amount per se, or and kind of how do you see that? That's from Bob Barnes, who serves on our advisory board. So thanks, Bob, for that question. Samantha, I saw you unmuted. Do you want to start on that one?
Sure. It kind of goes to the heart of the first point that I raised, which is really this governance challenge. And as a former local official who's also worked in the federal government and state government, I think there's this perception among states that are not California, that are not Washington State or Colorado, that have confronted this issue head on, that the more they build their own state capabilities, the more that they raise revenue at the state level, the more that they build their own operating capability, their own flood and firefighting capability, the less they're depending on the federal government, but the federal government stuff is perceived as free. And so there's this kind of almost a moral hazard problem that really, until a state has to confront this from a political perspective, there may not be the incentive that would come after a terrible tragedy or a catastrophic event. I don't think that the legal barriers, these governance barriers, need to hinder progress, though. We already, for example, see the ways that states are building interstate compacts, are leveraging mutual aid agreements, are sharing information, sharing technological advancements and tools. And any model that is relying on Washington, D.C. to move first is based on a country that does not exist. So I really implore state leaders to take this moment seriously and to really think about, harnessing some of the governance changes that are already underway as FEMA and DHS look to step back from a primary disaster response and recovery role. But there is a huge problem of technical and financial capacity. That I do think is something that the federal government also needs to be taking seriously, that Congress needs to be thinking about whether the governance designs are sufficient to be able to move technical and financial assistance quickly. And then lastly, I would note that there's an important role here for the private sector, whether it's the building trades, contractors, but also insurance and reinsurance that's been mentioned. And there are lots of other partners that I could mention around real estate and such. But the governance framework is not quite there, but I would not wait. I think state legislatures and governors need to be taking this on quickly.
Can I put in 2 cents?
Yep, please.
So I have two thoughts immediately when I hear the question. One is there's this concept of whole of government, which I've always thought of as a myth. I really don't believe that there's an effective mechanism through which all federal agencies work together and sing Kumbaya. It just doesn't actually happen. They all have their own authorities. They have their own money. They have their own people they report to, and they act very separately and independently when all is said and done. Except I have been to a FEMA, operations center, mission response center during a disaster, and it is amazing that this myth that I thought didn't exist suddenly comes into being in those centers. And I think I don't know why it works. I would say that part of it is that the assets are deployed and they actually have a boss and they actually respond to the joint task force and the person in charge there, and that's what makes it work, and that people have been handed off as a temporary duty or an authority off to that person. I've seen DoD entities work well in that environment, responding to the FEMA lead. It is remarkable, and so. I would not be too pessimistic in the context of seeing that work. And I don't know how much that has changed in this current rethinking of FEMA, or if that part still exists. I would, ask the real experts here. I am simply, but I've watched through those centers, and it is better than I ever thought it could be. I will say that.
To respond very quickly to that, I have to agree. It is one of the great privileges of having served at FEMA to be a part of those convenings and being in the Emergency Operations Center, convening across the different departments and agencies. There's a reason that presidents show up in that room. But that is all in the context of responding to the catastrophe, responding to the disaster, right? Where do we have that level of commitment, leadership, coming together, and cooperation and collaboration and hazard mitigation before the disaster context, or in the mid to long-term recovery context? I do think that bodies like the Mitigation Framework Leadership Group, which is also a FEMA-led body, has also demonstrated that it can work at a very good level of leadership, that it can be cooperative, and that it can get hard things done. But we don't have a Stafford Act, per se, around hazard mitigation, pre-disaster investment across the entire federal government. But it's the Stafford Act in action that you are seeing in that room, along with a very strong tradition of commitment to getting it done together.
And it is a plus. I mean, I would just say that as we think about these types of things, if there could be, but before the disaster, and I would say left of boom, as it were, that doesn't happen. Everybody goes back to their corners. They have their own appropriations and their own authorities. Those conversations are harder to have when you're not forced into it in a crisis. And that maybe we need more crises. I don't know. No, probably not. That's probably not what we wish for in this context. Okay.
Thanks, John. Christine, can I bring you in on this? Because I think one thing I've been impressed by with California too is some of, it's really been the test bed for some of these cooperative arrangements. I think of like Task Force Rattlesnake, for example, which brings the National Guard together on a very regular basis with the state firefighters. I mean, how do you see this cooperation piece across governments?
Yeah, I was going to mention Task Force Rattlesnake. In 2019, 2020, we had a recognition that we needed more boots on the ground, if you will. And at that time, CAL FIRE really did not have hand crews. And we recognized we needed that type of work, not just for wildfire response, but for the mitigation. And at the same time, the hand crews that we were using were Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation crews, so our inmate crews. And those crews were diminishing, and for a lot of reasons, which we won't go into here. But during 2020, during the pandemic, the availability of those crews reduced even more. And so we really had to look at how do we fill in, and where we looked to was the military and dedicated crews to support in the mitigation and response. And so that partnership continues today. It also continues with our aircraft support. When we have big disasters, we get additional military support through our aircrafts, through our modular airborne firefighting systems. Those are called MAFs. Those are just really capable aircraft that help support that response. But we do rely on those partnerships with our other state agencies and our government, our federal government partnerships. Like I said at the beginning, 58% of California's land is federally owned. We have to have partnerships with those people because the citizens who are impacted by wildfires on those properties or outside of those properties, they're citizens of California. And it's our duty to help support and protect them. So we have to do that with strong partnerships across the board. There are challenges, of course, and we work through those in the quote unquote off season, which, as was also mentioned, there is no off season, but yes, so those relationships are very important to our strategy.
Great. Thanks. There are some more questions on this collaboration, coordination among different entities and how the federal government can be more supportive. And we can come back to those, but I want to get to a couple other very specific questions here. One, I think, John, you're best to address, which is what is being done to understand and assess wildfires' direct and indirect effects on DoD's critical supply chain providers?
So if you're asking how DoD is looking at supply chains, I think the answer is very little, right? The supply chain, the Industrial Base Policy Office is doing work on supply chains, and they're analyzing them and trying to understand, where the sources are. But do they think about supply chain resilience, the resilience of those assets, the protection of those assets? That's less so. That almost begs for conversations to be going on between the sort of the installations and environment types of folks who deal with these kinds of resilience issues and the industrial based policy folks who deal with supply chains, and asking them to talk to each other, which doesn't happen as often as you might think. Actually, maybe you don't think it happens very often, and you'd be right. Maybe it happens more now, in fairness. But I think that's the crossover you'd need, and that's all within the Pentagon, in order to think about that. But I haven't seen evidence that that's currently going on, until the crisis happens, right? Until all of a sudden you go, oh, wait a minute, we can't get any more of X, Y, or Z. Then they try and figure out what to do about it.
Thanks, John. This question is for Sam or Christine or both. How do you see the state of preparation for wildfire threats that might threaten high-profile events prone to attract disinformation, like elections, for example, or the upcoming Olympics in California? How are you thinking about that? Sam, I'll go to you.
Sure. The good news there is that I do think the country's gotten very good at walking and chewing gum at the same time. And I think World Cup, the preparations around World Cup were a very good, real world exercise around preparing across the full range of departments and agencies for, the U.S. to host major high profile events with big crowds concentrated in very public, difficult to control environments. And very good thinking went into that years in advance. As soon as we knew that we were hosting, even before sites had been selected, there was that sort of pre-positioning of collaboration across key departments and agencies and programs, as well as sites were being selected with state and local leaders to look not just at what it means to host and what it means to have this level of population concentration and security just with that, but also the potential for compound or complex threats and hazards to come along, from anthropogenic to weather-related and more, and the ways that those can combine on a single bad day. And so I think there's very good news there, and I think that the governors and mayors and first responder cadres that were a part of those collaborations learned a lot. We all grew a lot through that work. But the ones that were not might not have benefited. And so one of the things that I would be interested in is, what are the ways that we can take some of those lessons learned from the World Cup journey and apply that into things like Olympics or even Super Bowls or other big, high profile, very public, very difficult to control events against a backdrop of increasing domestic security issues, increasing international outside the US actor issues, and then cyber threats and threats to technology and infrastructure. So I would love to see that. I'm no longer in government, so I can't speak to whether or not that's happening. But it sure would make an awful lot of sense to really give the broader nation the benefit of what we learned along the way.
Yeah, no, thanks, Sam. And I'm really struck by this point and what you were saying earlier about some states being more experienced than others. And how do you transfer that knowledge, right? From experiences like World Cup to other events? How do you build intrastate mutual aid, all of that to like do this learning, I think is a really good question. Christine, do you want to come in on this also?
Sure. Yeah, so California is getting ready to host several high profile events, including Super Bowl, the Olympics, and we already have teams in place that are
Yeah.
part of multiple working groups. And going back to jurisdictions and partnerships and things like that, really looking at the physical security and safety and really looking at life safety as number one. So through our Office of the State Fire Marshal programs, we have folks that are looking at that and really looking at jurisdictional issues, because as a state agency, we have the capacity to really support and manage some of these venues and inspect them in a way that the local jurisdictions do not, yet these venues are within their jurisdiction. So do we pull those into state jurisdiction? Do we change how we're managing these places in order to get through some of these massive events more easily? Again, securing life safety as number one. So you can imagine an event venue with thousands of people and somebody chooses to pop off a smoke bomb, you know, relatively harmless, but can create chaos. If that's not thoroughly vetted out, how all those people are getting out safely by our state officials, right, that can be problematic. So we're really looking at the physical sites and then also those jurisdictions, ensuring that everyone involved, because we have lots of people involved in this planning, understands who's in charge of a venue or that jurisdiction, who is the agency having jurisdiction. When it comes to the digital infrastructure, security and support and all of that, that's really being driven by each agency. And as I've already mentioned, we are very, very aware and on top of our digital security and have some methods in place for communications, emergency communications, if some of our digital infrastructure breaks down.
Great. Thank you. And I wish you luck in the coming year with all of this. It's going to be a busy year for California. All right, I'm going to end with I'm going to do a couple things. We've got a couple questions about the U.S. Wildland Fire Service and whether that initiative from President Trump can help with some of these ownership challenges we've identified, some of the governance challenges. So invite opinions on that. And then there's a related question that I'm going to ask all of you to touch on in just some few wrap-up remarks of wondering about what are creative and practical ways that you see that wildfire management can be tied to defense to improve outcomes in both worlds. Is it through the National Defense Authorization Bill? Is it through multiplying things like Task Force Rattlesnake to other jurisdictions, right? Like what are the best pathways there? What's on your wish list, if you will? So first, U.S. Wildland Fire Service, if anyone wants to comment on that, and then this kind of broader question of creative and practical ways. And maybe, Samantha, since you're out of government, I will allow you to comment on the U.S. Wildland Fire Service. John, too, if you'd like to, but we won't put Christine in the hot seat on that one.
Sure. And frankly, I think my answer wouldn't be that different even if I were still in government about the U.S. Wildland Fire Service. I think that the bottom line is that it continues to perpetuate a governance approach around essentially land management reorganization aimed at a problem that's no longer primarily about land management. The other thing that we have to bear in mind here is that wildfire, much like flood, is a natural phenomenon. There are ecosystem health benefits of fire. There are ecosystems that are fire dependent. And so it's not that fire is the enemy that we must suppress and fight every time. That actually, in many landscapes, got us where we are with intensification of fuels. And so it's not a land management problem, but it's not only and certainly not primarily a land management problem. And that to me is the issue with the U.S. Wildland Fire Service, that it stops short of the governance reforms that are really aimed at changing programmatic authority, completely changing the way that we deploy technical and financial assistance closest to the ground where it can make the biggest difference. And the last thing that I'll mention, if I may, about a wish list, I think we really need to look at the ways that the private sector, particularly financial services and particularly the world of insurance and reinsurance and what they have to offer in a cross-sectoral collaboration, is something that is already very much underway in California and other parts of the arid West, but really needs to be zoomed out and looked at from a national policy and practice standpoint. We already see extraordinary analytic capabilities coming through catastrophe modeling and insurance. And when we see insurers and carriers not being able to operate with solvency in markets, that should tell us that there's a problem. And the answer is not to just make the insurance affordable. The answer is to buy down risk. So we've got to be doubling down, tripling down on our pre-disaster hazard mitigation, disaster risk reduction. Thank you, Ben Barnes. Investments, and also getting some of the smartest federal investment out there, which is in technical assistance, sustained, skilled, multidisciplinary technical assistance as close to the ground as possible to help our mayors, our tribal leaders, our leaders in territories and governors get out ahead of this problem and manage it so that it doesn't have to become a federal disaster, but instead can be something that gets managed closer to the ground.
Great. Thanks so much, Sam. John, I'll let you go next.
Sure. So first, the Wildland Fire Service. I think that it is important to understand that when you reorganize within a single department, you can have efficiencies within that single department. If you're reorganizing within the Department of Interior to align different authorities and different organizations that have to do with wildfire, you may make an improvement within that scope. But I don't think you fix everything outside of it. So my initial reaction, moving the desk chairs around in anywhere doesn't usually result in vast improvements of things. So you'll probably get some marginal improvement within the management within that agency. I don't think it solves the broader problem. And then going to thinking about wish lists, I go back to when the DoD thinks about this problem, they think about protecting their mission from the hazard. They think about, how do I continue to do my job, what I'm supposed to be doing in the face of this external consequence and external problem. If you're going to have people work together, you need to have common objectives, and they have to be very clear, because otherwise you're going to get people going past each other. Nobody's going to do the right things to coordinate. And I think that's why the operations center that FEMA does works so well, right? Because everybody goes in there, they have one job, they have a common mission, and they aim for it, rather than having different federal agencies and different state agencies and et cetera trying to do whatever they're optimizing for. And so that coordination and that single leadership perspective is, I think, important. So going back, I'm not going to give you a wish list of what I want to see done, because what I want to see done is for people to figure out what their common objective is first. If we're all going to sit here and all have different missions and all have different priorities, where is the overlap where we all have the same priority? And then let's do that. But I don't think they're there yet. And I don't think they have designated that yet. So that's what I would say.
Thanks. I think that's a useful admonition. Christine.
Yeah, I'm going to go straight to my wish list. And I agree with John. We have to have a common objective so that we're all on the same page, kind of moving in the same direction. However, I'm just going to go pie in the sky here with my wish list, and that is that we work on the problem before it's a disaster, and that we work with our communities and we work with our local governments to change people's attitude about the problem. And if we can get people to shift from "it won't happen to me" to "it could happen to me, it will happen to me. What am I going to do to protect myself and my community?" And then also be rewarded for that behavior. Right now, there's no incentive. It's people have the attitude that it is easier to let my house burn than to do the mitigations to save it. And the reason for that is we are in an insurance crisis that we are trying to solve right now. So my pie in the sky is that the mitigations that people do to their homes and properties and communities impacts directly their insurance, and that people can get insured, people can live in their homes, and sell their homes. We have story after story of insurance issues creating for people. I know my insurance gets canceled every year. And so we're constantly dealing with trying to get insurance. And one of my homes does not have fire insurance. They just won't do it. So if that house burns down, that's that. So my pie in the sky is we're able to solve this problem on the front end and really work on that mitigation piece as if it were a disaster right in front of us, like we do with our wildfires. While we have increased our capabilities in the air and on the ground, we know that there are certain situations where we are just not going to respond our way out of that wildfire or the crisis overall. So we've got to work on these other mitigations, solving our insurance issues, and then using policy to support our values around wildfire mitigation. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you. And I am very happy to end on a ambitious wish list. I think that's important to have in these conversations. Thank you all so much. I think it was really enlightening to have these different perspectives from folks who sat in different parts of government or are currently sitting as you are, Christine. I think there's a lot to deepen and explore here, and a lot of opportunity, frankly, to take some of these great examples, especially from the work in California, and think about how do we expand that to other locations. Thanks everyone from joining us today. We will have recorded this. We will post it. We also will have a new wildfire briefer coming out from the Center for Climate and Security in the next few weeks. So please go to our website and sign up if you haven't already to continue to get updates from us on all of this work. Again, Sam, Christine, John, thank you so much for your time. Really brilliant insights, and we all appreciate the opportunity to learn from you. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.